Yeah. One of the highlights of that speech he just gave was at his lunch afterwards. I left my Bible home, and so I have a loaner here. I hope I can find my way around in it. Well, somebody said, they never really complained about it, but they said that I'll go a long period of time, like 6 months, talking about the same thing over and over again. And I don't do that just because I don't have other things to say, but I remember years ago when I was younger, I never repeated a message. I never repeated a concept. I tried not to even repeat a sentence or a statement. That had to have been pride, I'm sure. But God would give me revelations, and I just kind of prided myself in never repeating, just always. And I was going to speak at this big church one time, and it was there were thousands of people there, and it was a big deal. And so I said, Lord, what? Give me a message. I want a fresh manna from heaven. And about 6 months earlier from that, he told me to start making outlines to my message. Now, I didn't make an outline to give the message because I never used notes. I was just making outline after I shared the message. And so I had about 5 of them in my briefcase, and I was praying, great drops of blood. God, what do you want me to do? And he said, so I'll just use one of the messages out of your briefcase. And so that was startled me a little bit. So I said, well, Lord, which one? Which one? He said, anyone, just pick one. I was like, okay, so I reached and randomly picked a message out, and it was exactly what they needed. And it kind of broke me a little bit of that thing of always fresh manna. And so now I've gone to the other extreme, and I keep saying the same thing over and over all the time. But I do that for a reason. I know a lot of cool stuff I can share with you, but you have to kind of, learning isn't complete until you learn to do. Until what you're learning shows up in your life, then what you're learning doesn't hold value. The whole purpose of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom is so it can be translated into behavior that contributes to relationships that bring satisfaction to people and to God. That's the whole purpose of it. And in our Western culture, we can easily be intellectually stimulated, accumulate a lot of knowledge, but Jesus said, you know a tree by its fruit. And we don't really have the fruit that knowledge was intended to produce in our lives. And we don't really have any way of examining that because we measure ourselves by what we know instead of how we live. And so we've been talking a lot about just the basics of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. I think that whenever you go into, whenever you start teaching people in any way of Christianity, there should be a harping on the Old and New Covenant, the differences between them. In other words, the gospel should be what you teach and preach continually all the time until it shows up in people's lives. Wouldn't you agree?
Yep.
Because here's the deception. Satan wants you to hear it, and then still slide right back into the old ways of relating, and then all the information, all the revelation does you zero good. Matter of fact, it does you harm because it gives you the sense that you have something that you really don't. And that kills your hunger and your appetite for any more, and that's the essence of religion. And then you try by human effort to live a converted life with an unconverted heart. I'll say that again. Then you try by human effort to live a converted life with an unconverted heart. And then you try by human effort to live a converted life with an unconverted heart. That is the essence of the false religion that inoculates you from the real thing. When I say fruit in your life, I don't mean that you do good and try harder. I mean that the word that goes into your heart changes you. And so I'm going to share some about the grace and law, Old Covenant, New Covenant, but in the context of what it looks like in relationships. Because you can really get it down pat, like Jesus did it all, and you can understand all these concepts of the law, but and not really get it with your heart. I'll give an example. I was speaking at a church. It was a fairly, I guess, conservative Mennonite church. I'm not sure, but like the women sat on one side, the men sat on the other side. everything was pretty traditional, and they wanted freedom, and they invited me there to speak. And so I asked them a question, and I'll ask you all this. I'll ask you what I asked them. How many of you here understand and believe that you are dead to the law, the old covenant law of Moses? Raise your hand. If you believe you're dead to the law. Okay, put your hand back down. And that's good. When I asked them, about 30% of them raised their hands. And so I shared a few scriptures and I expounded a little bit. I might be long-winded this morning, just so you know. Just a little warning. And then I asked them again, about 65% of them raised their hand, and then finally about 90% raised their hand. After they did that, I said, did you know that the law, there are 613 commandments in the Old Covenant law? About half of those pertain to our relationship with God, and half of those pertain to our relationship with people. And then it gets distilled down into 10 commandments that was engraved in tablets of stone, and half of those have to do with our relationship with God, half our relationship with people, for the most part. And then Jesus asking a lawyer what was the most important commandment, the lawyer answered Jesus, and he distilled it down into 2 commandments. And Jesus said, yep, these 2 commandments embody the entire law. So you can take 613 commandments and squeeze them into these 2. Those 2 commandments were this: thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy mind, thy strength, thy might, thy everything you got, and love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. And he said, that's the whole law. Amen. Now, it's easy to say you're dead to the law when you say, well, the law, I can wear pants if I want to, I can eat pork if I want to, I can eat catfish if I want to, I can wear different threads on my body at the same time, I can put different seeds in the same piece of ground at the same time. I don't have to worship on a certain day. I don't have to sacrifice animals. It's easy to say you're dead to the law, but I'll ask you again, this is the law. Yes. You are commanded to love God with everything that's in you, all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your might, all of your strength, and you are commanded to love your neighbor as yourself. That is the law. Yeah. How many of you now believe that you're dead to the law? It's amazing how all of a sudden these new covenant believers suddenly are not dead to the law anymore when they fully understand what the law is saying. The law is not about rituals that you can live without. It's about relationships that you can't. You should have seen them. They looked even more shocked than you did because you're used to me doing crazy stuff and saying crazy things. And this is the first time I was ever in this church. Probably the first time a black man's ever been in there. Might have been the first time a speaker's been in there. It seemed that way anyway. And so when I told them, you're dead, I said, how many of you believe you don't have to love God? You don't have to love your neighbor. Because that's the law. Did you know that's the law? Jesus summarized it down in its simplicity. That's the heart and the essence of the law. You don't have to love God. It's hard then to say I'm dead to the law. What that does is it tests your understanding of what you know about being under law. Well, it says in Romans 7 that we are dead to the law. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that everything's lawful for me. Not everything's a good idea, he says. Not everything is expedient. But everything's lawful for me to do. I think it's quite funny. Because you are not a conservative group. There's men and women sitting all together, all kinds of stuff. You've come a long way, baby. But when it came to what I just asked you, the overwhelming majority of you have not advanced in your understanding beyond that conservative Mennonite church when it comes to, are you dead to the law? I think Beth was the only one who raised her hand. Anybody else that raised their hand when I asked it? It was just Beth. Beth's the only one saved here. I want to explain that, though, because did you know you don't have to love God? You don't have to, because Jesus died on the cross, and you don't have to do it anymore. I'll tell a little story. Some of you have heard this, but repeat stories are remembered better. So my daughter had just gotten married, and my wife's mother, who had been married for 52 years, was giving her advice on marriage, marital advice. Of course, she would have tons of advice. She'd been married for a long time. Anytime you do something for a long time, you're an expert at it, correct? Couldn't probably do something wrong for 52 years. But anyway, and my daughter, I know she meant no disrespect, but she said, I know, Nana, we went to Pastor so-and-so, and we got premarital counseling, and he gave us books, we read the books, we read some other books, we've heard it all, we've read the books. I know, Nana, it's instruction on how to be married when you're not in love. And when I heard her say it, I'm standing in the kitchen and she's in the living room, I was like, I'm going to move in another direction because I know Nana was quite offended. But she didn't realize that, young people. Did you know that our relationship with God, the metaphor that's used more often than any other when it pertains to our relationship with God as a people, as humans and the divine, is husband and wife. Israel and God, Christ and the church, it's husband and wife. So here, let me put it into that context, like we're married to God, because that's the metaphor he uses. I'll use that. He uses metaphors so to make things easier to understand. So here we go. The old covenant is instruction on how to be married to God when you're not in love. How many of you men, if you really liked a woman and you fell in love with her, but she didn't really love you, but you were living in a society where there were arranged marriages and you never really fell in love. She never really fell in love with you, but here's what she did. She would read and recite all the things that a woman does when she's in love, and she would practice it and memorize it. She would get it down pat. She was disciplined. She was committed. And you could, she down to the very finest duty. She would be everything that paper said a wife should be, but she really wasn't in love with you. Her whole motivation was to avoid negative consequences. She knew that if she didn't do something right, negative things would happen. So in a way, her whole motivation would be self-preservation, self-promotion, survival. It would be anything except for head over heels in love. How many men would be happy with that arrangement? Anybody at all? None? How many of you would want a woman who didn't do everything right? She even burnt the birthday cake, set off all the alarms in the house. She backed the truck into a tree. It sounds like Brad Fowler's papers on enough. A little moment. What if she did everything wrong, but this woman was head over heels in love with you? Every time you walked through the door, she was about to faint. When you kissed her, she needed a catcher. But she wasn't a great cook, but she was learning from your mom was teaching her to cook, and she was learning and growing. She didn't do everything perfect. She wanted to because she loved you. Not because there was going to be some reward in it for her or avoid some punishment. She wanted to make sure she cooked your eggs just the way you liked them, not because she was afraid of failing at some duty, but because she wanted to please you because the woman's in love. And she over time, because of her love, she gets better at learning how to please you to such a degree that she goes way beyond what's on the paper. How many of that sounds good?
Yeah.
Well, don't you think that you were made in God's image? Don't you think he feels the same way?
Yep.
You see, God doesn't want you loving him because it's commanded. If that was the case, he was given the law way back in the Garden of Eden. The law didn't even come until 430 years after Abraham. God promised Abraham and he believed him. God doesn't want your love because it's commanded. God wants you to see him as he is and then fall in love.
Amen.
One of the reasons that he even planted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden is because if you didn't have an option to say no, your yes becomes meaningless.
Right.
See, until you're completely free to reject someone, accepting them has no meaning to them. A forced relationship is control. But when people are completely free, they come under the influence of one another. Relationships are designed to be governed by influence and nothing less. When a mother duck has babies, she sits on them for a while and quacks until the eggs crack. And then she sits on them a little longer after they hatch. And then she walks in. When they're in the tall grass, she just makes that same little sound and they can find her. She's doing what's called an imprinting. That's because she doesn't have any hands to hold a switch to keep them in line. She has to have something called influence. She can't control her little duckling. She can't push them where they need to go. She has to lead them, and they have to follow, but they have to follow because they're under the influence of that duck. Everything in life, every relationship that actually works, it works by two people who are totally free not to love each other, can't help themselves. And so our relationship with God is like a man and a woman, like the first man, Adam and Eve. Listen to what the Old Covenant says. It says, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. In other words, you should and you shouldn't. You should and you shouldn't. You should and you shouldn't. Shouldn't and should and shouldn't. That's what it all says. And basically, it's saying if you want a right relationship with God, it all depends on you. 100% depends on you. And of course, everybody failed at that. Here's what the New Covenant says. In Jeremiah 31, he says, behold, in that day, I will make a new covenant with my people. It will not be like, so it'll be different, the covenant that I made with them when I took them out of Israel by the hand, which covenant they broke, even though I was the husband to them. But this covenant, because, he wrote that covenant in the tablets at Sinai, he said, this covenant I'm going to write in their heart. I'm going to write it inside of them. And not only that, I'm going to be their God and they're going to be my people. I'm going to forget and forgive all of their sin and all their trespasses. And then he adds this as part of the promise. And they will walk in my ways. It's not a command, it's a promise. The new covenant statement begins with, you shall, and then the rest is walk in his ways. The old covenant begins with, and they shall walk in my ways. Part of something that he gives as a promise. Now, how in the world does that work? God's trusting something other than our will to walk in his ways. Well, in the new covenant, you notice everything's based on what God does or what God has done. The old covenant, everything's based on what we do in order to maintain right relationship with God. So here's what happens. We call freedom, in our modern day, we're hearing the gospel preached. Here's how we call freedom. We say freedom is the absence of law. How many of you are understood it that way? You live for generations under restrictions, under guides, under pressures, under laws that are forcing you to do things you don't always want to do, and then you have to confess when you mess up, and then you get punished. It's all this negativity and problems surrounding your behavior, and there's pressure motivating you to do what's right. Very little reward, but a lot of threat of punishment, right? And so that's what the old covenant, that's what we think of freedom is. Okay, take this law away. I'm free. As Lynn Howell says, on Facebook, free. I've heard some of these so-called free people who are in bondage to their liberty say all kinds of stuff that's offensive on Facebook because they're free. Paul said in Galatians 5:13, don't use your freedom as an opportunity to serve you, but use your freedom motivated by love as an opportunity to serve others. Love. We try to understand grace versus law without ever thinking about love. See, freedom is not the absence of law, it's just chaos. You will go into greater bondage, just a different type, if you take away law and you don't have love in this place. See, freedom is the presence of love, not the absence of law. I'll explain. Let's see, in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, he's talking about all the heroes of faith. We say heroes of faith, but he's talking about all these great cloud of witnesses. The way it's been taught to us is these people are all in heaven and they're witnessing us running our leg of the race. How many of you have heard it taught that way? That is all these witnesses watching us. Well, actually, if you were to change the word, you get a better understanding of what Paul's saying. He said, this great cloud of examples, they're for us to look at. Yeah. Look to these. Their lives are an example of how you are to live yours. All of them in Hebrews 11 are Old Testament saints. Old Testament saints lived in such a way that it demonstrates to us New Testament saints how to live. And every one of them was under the law. They were under the law, obligated to the law, but yet they lived in such a way that it's an example to us how to live when we're not under the law. And I'll explain, like the law, if there was a law that could produce life, then certainly righteousness would have come by the law. From Galatians, Paul said that. But here's what happened. Those old covenant saints were under the law. For instance, David was under the law. God said this about David, he's a man after my own heart. God looked at David's heart and said, that man's got a heart like me. Did you know the law didn't produce that? The law couldn't produce that. In 1 Timothy 1:9, here's what it says. The law was not given. I should read that, actually. Well, while I'm turning to that, I'll continue to talk about David. David is in the chapter in Hebrews that says he pleased God. And that chapter starts out saying, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So David pleased God by faith. Now, where did that faith come? In 2 Corinthians 5, it says that faith works by love. So faith, Bible page that says 10, isn't that amazing? So if faith works by love, to put it into simple language is this. When you are fully persuaded that somebody loves you and they're for you and not against you, you trust them. I'll say that again. When you're fully persuaded that someone really loves you and that they are for you and that they're not against you, you trust them. And in our relationship with God, he says, our response that we believe, that we know that he loves us, that we got the message that we're loved, is faith. And so David, here's David under the law, but yet when he's under the law, Saul starts to chase him. And David's running from Saul in the wilderness. Now here's what the law says. At a certain time each year, you have to come to the temple in Jerusalem. You have to offer a particular sacrifice unto the Lord. That's the law, and you have to keep it. Guess what? David couldn't do that. Saul was probably waiting to see if he was going to do that. David would have been killed if he did it. So David couldn't do that. So David's out in the wilderness. What is he going to do? He said, oh, Lord, accept the bullock of my lips. Let the lifting of my hands be like the evening sacrifice. Because he couldn't keep the law. He wasn't allowed to keep the law. He was kept by Saul away from keeping the law. And David, when he goes to get the showbread, the law says that common people can't eat that showbread. David ate it. And Jesus used it as an example. Here's the thing. David's in a cave. He's in the cave of Adullam. I think this is in 1 Samuel 23. David's running from Saul. Saul takes 3,000 chosen men out of Israel, warriors, to catch up with David, who at the time had like 400 to 600 men to kill him. And they're running from him. And David and his men go into this cave, and they're hiding in all these crevices and caverns in the wall of the cave. And Saul's men are going to go right past, except for Saul has to go to the bathroom. So Saul had all 3,000 armed men waiting to see if they can find David, are outside of the cave. Saul's inside of the cave to go to the bathroom. And back then, everybody wore dresses. So Saul took his dress off, and he laid it over on the side of the rocks. He really did. You know that scripture about a woman not dressed in men's clothes, and we get all caught up in the pants dress issue? Everybody wore dresses back then. There weren't any pants yet. Anyway, the English invented pants. It's the same. Those sinners. So he's got his maxi dress laying over a rock, and David's there, and they say to David, they said, look, the day that the Lord promised you, he said, the day was going to come when he would deliver your enemy into your hand to do whatever you wanted with it. That was the word of God. David, and he fulfilled it. Here's your enemy, you can do whatever you want to him. God himself gave David the liberty to do whatever he wanted to his enemy. So David goes down and he cuts Saul's dress in half. It goes from a maxi skirt to a mini skirt. And so when Saul leaves the cave, he walks out. Can you imagine what those 3,000 guys are thinking? And Saul walks out like, they don't even ask any questions. I ain't saying nothing. Saul's like, let's go get David. Anyway, David finally comes out behind Saul, and he's got the rest of Saul's garment in his hand, and he holds it up to Saul, and he says, Saul, he says, see, who is telling you I'm trying to hurt you? I had a chance to hurt you, and I did, and he's waving this garment. He bows down. At that point, David was a perfect target. All Saul's men could have killed him. Why in the world would David pass up the chance to kill Saul and go out in front of all those enemies and bow down, submit it like that to Saul's authority and say, hey, I'm not trying to kill you? And here's the thing. It said David's heart troubled him because he just cut Saul's skirt off. His heart troubled him just because he dared to touch Saul's skirt, because law does not produce that. Do you think David and Saul had this wonderful love relationship? I don't think so. David's love for God reflected in how he related to God's anointed. It wasn't a law that David had to do that. David, everything that David did that he's recognized for in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, he didn't do it because he was under a law that compelled him to do it. It's because he had a heart that produced it. See, we try to think about law versus grace without even bringing the heart into the equation. And so what we do is we turn the new covenant into instructions on how to be married to God without being in love. It doesn't matter what the instructions are. If the instructions are that you're free, it doesn't matter if the instructions are that you're bound. If you say, well, according to these instructions of our freedom, we're doing, if it's just instructions and there's no heart of love behind it, it's the old covenant.
Right.
It's the old way of relating to God, an outside motivation engraved in stone instead of an inner motivation written in your heart. If you don't fall in love with God, you have yet to begin to live the Christian life. You're a Christian, but to live the Christian life is a love walk. And it's not love that's forced by commandment. It's love where you see him as he is and how much he loves you, and you literally fall in love. God risks everything when you've fallen in love. He doesn't force you to do anything. So why did he add the law? People say, well, what purpose is the law? Why would God have a law then just to confuse us? No, we confuse ourselves. But let me help you understand the purpose of the law. God and man fell, and then Noah and his sons and their wives got off the boat, and they're going to start the human race once again. And then they had a governmental system, a patriarchal system, where fathers and mothers had influence over kids they were willing to die for. It's the only government that works that's called family. They had this going on. Then this young upstart named Nimrod rose up, and he was the first king in history, and his name means rebellion, or let us rebel, and he built this city called Babylon. In the Sumerian tongue, Babylon means the gate of heaven. In the Hebrew tongue, it means confusion. So they all came together, and they're building this tower in the city up to God, up to heaven. And really what they were doing, it was occultism. If you study in history, there's a lot of old occultism. Every dysfunction in the human experience that we're socially experiencing was started in Babylon. If you look at Romans 1, that whole testimony of Romans 1 is talking about Babylon. That's what it's talking about. Well, anyway, he rises up and God confuses their language, and they went in 70 different directions, 70 different families, and they started to live however they could. But every one of them replicated the government of Babylon, where they had a king and all of his subjects. The king was not necessarily for the people, he was just over the people. And the people were for the king. And it was unlike family. In family, the parents will lay their lives down for their children. Human government was first depending on love in order to work. Humans were designed to be ruled by love. Self-government, relational government, family government, everything by love. When love goes out, it's not family anymore. That's what God intended. And see, that would enable God to rest. He didn't have to micromanage this process of human government. All they had to do was love each other. And so he set it up so that family was the government that works. Even if you have a nation, it can have a governmental family system, but that's a different story. Well, Nimrod was thinking about Nimrod. All the people were for him. He ruled by conquest, and he didn't have the love and care for the people. So he changed the way humans were governed. And that governmental system with a king and many subjects replicated all around the world. And then finally, God comes to Abraham, and he says, Abraham, I'm going to bless you. And all the families of the whole world will be blessed in you. And in your seed shall all the families of the whole world be blessed. And so God blesses Abraham, and he calls him a father of many nations. God's reestablishing the only government that works, family. There's not a king at the top, there's a father at the top. And he says your descendants, this, that, and the other. And so 430 years later, God has given the law to Abraham's descendants, because God had a plan that in the fullness of time, Christ would come, the Messiah, to redeem. He was the seed of Abraham that all the families of the earth would be blessed in. And so until from the time of Abraham to the time of Moses, to the time of David, to the carried away of Babylon, all the way to Christ, that's a long road for them to be a people that God could use through whom the Messiah could come. So here's what God did. He gave the law when he brought Israel out of Egypt. Why didn't he give it before then? Because they were slaves in Egypt They were controlled by others, and so there's only so much they could do. They were working the whole time. They were working like slaves the whole time, so they didn't have any time for sin to get out of hand. And sin is the opposite of love. Sin is when you hurt people and do things that aren't good for them. Well, when they came out of the wilderness, so they're on their own, God gave them the law. And here's what Paul says about the whole purpose of the law. It says this in 1 Timothy 1, I can't even see it. Okay, 1:9. Okay. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person. Hear that? The law, it was not, see, God made the law. He gave the law. The law was not given for righteous people. The law was not given for righteous people. Righteous people don't need the law. The law was never at any time in history given for righteous people. The law was not given, well, I'll read it again. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous, let me say it for you right there. For a righteous person. The law was not given for a righteous person. If you're righteous, you don't need the law. You didn't even, if you were righteous, you didn't even need the law back then. The law was never given for a righteous person. Well, who was it given for then? It was, in other words, the rule, don't do this thing, was never given to the people who don't do that thing. But for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers. And it goes on and on and on, a list of people doing bad stuff, and it says that anything that's not according to the glorious gospel of Christ. Well, when he gave the law, here's the purpose, that he did not give the law to make people righteous. The law was not given, he gave the people law to limit sin. Not to eliminate sin. If the law could eliminate sin, there would be no need for all the animal sacrifices and the annual sacrifices of which their blood covered their sin for a year or for a season or whatever happened. The law was not given to righteous people. The law was given over Israel for this purpose, for all those people who were gonna hurt other people by doing stuff that didn't work. For all the sinners, the ungodly, the unrighteous, for the selfish, for the murderers, all this. That's who it was given for. Was everybody in Israel that? Nope. Well, the people who weren't that didn't need the law. Were they under the law? Yes. They were all under the law. But the only ones that really needed the law that they were under were the ones that were not self-governed by law. The only ones that didn't need the law that they were under were the ones that were not, the ones that were self-governed by law. They didn't need that law. So, to give you a practical example, how many men here have ever fallen in love? Put your hand up in the air, waving like you just don't care. There's some enthusiasm. How many men have ever fallen in love? Anyway, so imagine when you first fall in love and you just got married and everything, and what if there was this law in the land that said, thou shalt passionately kiss thy wife at least once a week. If not, there's going to be severe consequences. Would you say, man, I do not like being under the bondage of this law? You wouldn't even need that law. It wouldn't matter to you if you had the law or not, would it?
That's right.
Because you got a motivation that's in you instead of one that's outside.
Right.
Like, you'd be kissing your wife more than once a week, and then the law you wouldn't get any greater reward, or see the reward was the kiss. Just use an example maybe somebody can relate to. There are some things in life that we are motivated to do from within. And anything that you're not motivated to do from within isn't exactly real. However, you have to keep in mind, some people lack inward motivation. They're called children. They lack inward motivation to consider others. And so you need outward motivation and structure until they internalize it, and then they have inward motivation. A grown-up is measured by how much concern they have for others. Kids mean well, but they can be pretty mean. Have you ever noticed? That's because babies, infants, survive by being self-centered, by being selfish. The whole world must revolve around them or they won't survive. Anything goes wrong in their life, they scream until mommy comes and fixes it. They never are aware of anything going wrong in mommy's life. They never say, I better keep the noise down, mommy's trying to sleep. It's all about them. And it has to be all about them. That's how they survive. That's the measure of immaturity. But maturity is measured by the mom who didn't get enough sleep and she's still getting enough. She's walking the floor with her baby. She's sacrificing all kinds of things. Why? Because she loves that baby and she's mature. The baby loves mommy too, and that love grows. However, there's a difference between mature and immature love. Mature love is represented more by the mommy. Here's what the Bible says, that we were kept under the law until we would grow up. And it says in Ephesians 4 that we would grow up into the likeness of Christ, into the full stature of Christ. Full stature of Christ, he loved so much he gave his life. In 1 Corinthians 3, it says, if there are divisions and strife among you, you are yet carnal and babes in Christ, just like people of this world. You still need milk and not solid food. So here's a Christian who is immature, still a Christian, and still loves God. They're immature, though. They're just like people in the world. There's zero difference. Do you know any Christians who are just like people in the world? Looking at the fruit of their life. Y'all don't know any? And they justify because they're free of the law. That's true. That's good that you're free of the law, but you don't have anything to replace it. God did not set us free to be unlike him. He set us free to be like him. But you got to be free to be unlike him so that you can be able to be like him. In other words, you're not free from, you'll never be free from sin until you're free to sin. If you're not free from sin, you're going to need a law to keep you from hurting others. But see, the gospel sets you free to sin so that you can be free from sin by falling in love.
Right.
Does that make sense? Is this making sense? Is it hard to understand, or is it okay? It's fairly easy. So David was under the law, but he didn't need the law he was under. It was like the man who was commanded to kiss his wife once a week. David was under the law, but he didn't need it. He did break the law before the thing with Bathsheba and numbering Israel. He did go outside of the bounds, and there were consequences associated with doing that. However, he did not lose relationship or covenant or connection with God. David did not live by the law that was over him. He lived by the love that was in him. This is so important. Because if we never fall in love with Jesus, we won't be able to love one another. And if we don't see Jesus exactly as he is, we can't fall in love with him. Your idol, your image of him, you can't fall in love with because it's demanding something of you that you don't have. The true Jesus is supplying something that you lack. I hope you're hearing what I'm saying. Because if you're not in love with Jesus, it'll show up in your life. And where does it show up? What's the fruit? How you relate to others. And where does it start at? Usually at home. Could be with your wife and you're with the children. I'm just saying this not to make anybody feel bad, but so that we can repent of this living under the law thinking that we're free from it. It really is. See, you're only free from the law when love takes its place. Now, here's what we need to do. We need to say, wait a minute. If I'm unloving, I'm still legalistic. See, we think, oh, if I'm unloving, I'm a sinner. That's true, okay? I'll give you that. But you're also legalistic. Because there's only two things that can govern relationship, and that's love or law. And so some of the people who think they are the most free are the most legalistic. They just don't use the laws of the Bible. I'm free from the laws of the Bible. I've got my own set of laws. And they'll tell you what they'll do and what they won't do and how things work and how other people, they got this whole system of law of how life works. And they're unloving. And the reason is because it's impossible to be legalistic and loving at the same time. And I could go on and on. I'm not going to, but in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, at the end when it talks about those, you know what's funny? I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I've had about 5 cups of coffee, 3 cups of water, and I'm about to end my message because I have to go to the bathroom. That's just plain God's honest truth. Okay, now where was I? Something like this. So if you see me leave, I've already introduced this awkward moment so that if I leave and come back, you all can sing praises till I return, in case I don't make it down this home stretch. Anyway, and I'm constantly feeding the problem. Jerry, come up and speak before I come back. Say anything, it doesn't matter. We can do an advertisement, anything, come on. Talk about the fact.
So what do you want to hear? I would say I had let's see, Marcus, what's Marcus saying? To me, Marcus always argued about grace and law. He used to say I hate law. But I would say I had the absence of love. You know, I said there's no more law, this is grace, you know. But I didn't have love like I should have for my fellow people. I didn't realize that until yesterday. The opposite of law is having love. Or you just love. And that means you don't have any shame or fear in your life. And I think I knew some of that, but I really, yesterday he was going over some of this stuff. I'm like, whoa, okay. I'm starting to believe it. If you can't feel like, you know, the searing of the conscience we've always been taught is, you know, we taught from our legalistic viewpoint where we grew up in that it is when you can't sin without having conscience about it. The searing of the conscience is actually when you can't relate with people, you can't feel how people feel. And then you just sit, you know, you can't go there. And you know, I had to think where I sat down and where the preacher would bring me in, and they couldn't, it would, you know, tell me what I was doing wrong, and they couldn't even relate to how I felt about it. And they were like just bringing the law to me. So of course, coming out of that, coming out of that, you know, I was always against. I want to do everything opposite of whatever, you know, I came out of. So when we don't have love, we're still legalistic.
Good word. That's so true. I'm glad you said that, because here's what will happen. You will conform to this restrictive culture that you're in. Amish culture is a good example of it. And then you come out of Amish culture and you find some kind of freedom in some English style of worship. I'm just using examples. I know these aren't exact examples. And then you conform to this over here, which appears to be freedom in every kind of way. But if you're conforming, you're fitting in by conforming, it's not freedom. Freedom comes through transformation. He said, Paul said in Romans 12:2, be not conformed, but be transformed. When you're transformed, you're translated into the kingdom of his dear son. The way you think, the way you live, and everything is not like any culture on the face of the earth. Your citizenship of heaven begins to shine through. And I've seen so many people, it is better to be in blatant Anabaptist restricted culture where you're under heavy legalism and know that you're bound than to be in what seems to be shackle-free bondage to a new way of relating to God that still did not come out of your transformation, that came out of you conforming to something better. And because now you don't know, now you just come into a greater bondage because you're in a bondage without an awareness. There are so many people I've watched in this culture where they'll come under the influence of another culture and think that they've been set free. I was talking to some people, and I like sharing this because it's so daggone fun, and they were like, you know, they were saying a few bad things about Amish culture, and there's so many wonderful things about Amish culture that I personally love. I've experienced so many cultures around the world, and so far, this is my favorite, I have to say, honestly. And so they were talking about they have so much multi-generational integrity and work ethic and all this stuff. And so I started picking on the Amish culture and just saying bad stuff about it on purpose. And they got all defensive, you know.